Good afternoon. I'm Douglas Jacoby. I'm speaking to you from North River, which is our church building, which these days with the virus is very empty and quiet. But greetings to everyone from Atlanta. And this is iFaith video sermon number 52, which I've entitled Shame, Shame, Shame. 2 Timothy is regarded as Paul's final letter. Paul was executed under the Emperor Nero, who died in 68 AD, Nero. So that would be the latest year of Paul's execution and probably the latest possible year for this letter. Some people have actually suggested that 2 Timothy is less of a letter and more like a testament, as in a last will and testament. And we're going to approach it from that angle in our next talk. It's highly personal. It seems that Paul, he shares a lot of personal information, but there's a particular situation that's very painful to Paul, and that is that many of his associates, Christian leaders, have drawn back from him when he was arrested and have not been supportive. For one reason or another, they've been embarrassed or ashamed. Now, 2 Timothy is quite different to 1 Timothy and Titus, where we've had our last four lessons. You'll find in 1 Timothy and Titus advice, very practical instruction given to men and women, everybody, on blending into society. And I don't mean compromising, more like being all things to all men and not bringing reproach on the gospel unnecessarily. 2 Timothy has a different focus. It's more focused on standing out, being different from society. This is not a contradiction. Maybe a paradox. Of course, as Christians, in some ways, we want to blend in. We're part of the human race, and we want people to be able to relate to us, and we have certain needs. On the other hand, there's no way to follow Christ and not be persecuted, as 2 Timothy 3:12 says. We're going to stand out. It's really a question of whether we care more about God's opinion of us or human opinion. Well, in 2 Timothy, sadly, many Christians have withdrawn from Paul. Now, what's going on behind the scenes is illuminated if we appreciate that this is a culture of honor and shame, the ancient Mediterranean world. So is much of our modern world. In the West, we relate more to guilt. We're motivated by duty, guilt, much more than we are by honor and shame. And part of that is because we're more individualistic, whereas in most of the world, and certainly the ancient New Testament world, things were less individual, much more corporate. And so we don't want to bring shame on our families or society. In the modern age, it's almost a virtue to stand out and be different and challenge the society. So 1 Timothy and Titus speak of acting in culturally acceptable ways. 2 Timothy is aiming to give confidence, particularly to Timothy, who's the recipient, confidence that we must behave in some culturally unacceptable ways, and yet that actually will bring more honor than if we capitulate to the world. Let me just give a couple of examples before we actually get into our text. In the Roman Empire as an empire is lasting from the 1st century BC, for quite a few centuries, but there were many public holidays. I don't mean it was, you had Mother's Day and Honor Your Postman Day. It wasn't like that. These are holidays connected with the glory and the military might and the gods of Rome. So there was a certain civic responsibility. If your neighbors are all celebrating and they're offering sacrifices, they're bowing down to statues, they're glorifying the state. And actually in the Roman Empire, Roma was a goddess. I mean, the state itself was divine, and the emperors as well. So to take part in the parades, the pageants, the festival, the drinking and everything, it wasn't just a worldly set of activities. It was an occasion of multiple idolatry, and Christians withdrew from those things. They might have been viewed as bad citizens, even though they were very supportive, better neighbors than most non-Christians. they were viewed as being antisocial in some ways because they pulled back. When it came to military service, same thing. If you were baptized in the army, no problem, as long as you didn't kill your enemy, as long as you loved him. But in the army, there were three problems. There was all the idolatry, there was taking oaths, which were forbidden, and then the obvious one of loving one's enemy. So Christians, that was a tough one. There were dinner parties. Dinner parties were normally followed by entertainment. Young boys or beautiful women would be hired so the guests could have sex. There's the theater with all of the worldliness there, and normally Christians withdrew. They had nothing to do with that. And then, of course, there's the family pressure, which maybe that's even greater. People don't want to disappoint their family. So if I become a Christian, but my parents haven't done that too, I could be bringing dishonor on them. People asking, why doesn't your son follow you? Why doesn't your daughter follow you? So all that kind of pressure too. Does that make sense? Jesus talked about the sword, Matthew 10:34, the kind of division that happens and the way families may be divided when it comes to Christ. So again, 2 Timothy is more about overcoming shame in the eyes of the dominant culture. Society labels Paul a deviant just because he's a Christian and an outspoken Christian. And because he's a leader and he's in prison, that's considered even more shameful. I mean, that Jesus died was bad enough, but that he was executed, far worse, and that it was a slave's death on the cross, greatly shameful. And yet, persevering through times that others may consider to be shameful can actually bring eternal honor. That's in 2 Timothy 2:10. Enduring hostility and censure can lead to certain reward, 2 Timothy 2:11-13. And again, persecution is a reality for any serious Christian. Persecution is not a mark of shame, it's a badge of honor. So that's the background. I think that's important that we understand. And so Paul is writing 2 Timothy so that Timothy will not be ashamed. And obviously, those in his circle will be affected by this too. So we're just going to look at something I noticed as a young Christian, and just in chapter 1, the 3 times that shame is mentioned. That's why I'm calling the talk Shame, Shame, Shame. Starting in 1:7, for the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. So do not be ashamed of the testimony of our Lord or of me as prisoner. Rather, join with me in suffering for the gospel by the power of God. He has saved us and called us to a holy life, not because of anything we have done, but because of his own purpose and grace. So the first mention of shame here in verse 8, 2 Timothy 1:8, is asking Timothy not to be ashamed of the testimony or ashamed of Paul. In fact, Paul invites him to join with me suffering for the gospel of the power of God. Now, there's naturally the pushback of a godless world against our efforts to live a holy life, and that can make us shrink back or ashamed, even though we're doing what's right. But there's also a resistance that comes from the world when we take a stand, when we act hopefully more honorably, with more integrity, and when we are evangelistic and engaged. That opposition can even be violent. Paul asked Timothy not to be ashamed of him. It must have been a possibility. I'm not saying Timothy was ashamed, but Paul knows that that's important for the unity of the Christian movement. Paul speaks, going now to verse 11, of the gospel I was appointed a herald, apostle, and a teacher, and that is why I'm suffering as I am. Notice the word suffering appears again as it did in the previous passage. Yet this is no cause for shame, because I know whom I've believed. I'm convinced he is able to guard what I've entrusted to him until that day. So here, it's not about Timothy, it's about Paul. And Paul says he's not ashamed because he knows Jesus Christ. Imagine you're appearing before a minor provincial governor or magistrate. You might be intimidated or afraid to do something wrong. On the other hand, if you really believe you know the King of Kings, that's your boss's 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 boss. I mean, you know the top authority in the whole universe. You'll be not so ashamed. And Paul has that perspective. He's looking forward to that day. He mentions that day, the day of judgment, when right is rewarded, the righteous are vindicated, and evil is punished. And then in the last section, Verse 15, you know that everyone in the province of Asia has deserted me, including Phygelus and Hermogenes. May the Lord show mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, because he often refreshed me and was not ashamed of my chains. Let me just clarify. The province of Asia, that's the extreme western part of Turkey. Ephesus is the major city, a major city. There's several. And everyone there has backed off from Paul. They've distanced themselves. And they're not visiting him in prison, even though this is probably Paul's final imprisonment, after which he will be executed. And he mentions by name, very unusual to mention his opponents by name, but these were probably troublemakers. And then he says, may the Lord show mercy to the household of Onesiphorus. Interestingly, Onesiphorus, presumably it's that man himself that Paul is commending, came to Rome and found Paul, and he wasn't ashamed of his chains. Now, I'm reading into it a bit. This may be speculative, but I'm imagining that Onesiphorus did not know exactly where Paul was and had to ask around to find which prison, where was he being held. And it's not that honorable. Oh yeah, I want to visit someone. Who's that someone? In prison. What did he do wrong? Oh my goodness, ringleader of the Nazarene sect? You can see that people might want to be a bit vague, but you have to be specific if you want to find somebody, right? And he says, on the contrary, when Onesiphorus was in Rome, he searched hard for me until he found me. May the Lord grant that he will find mercy from the Lord on that day, the judgment day. You know very well in how many ways he helped me in Ephesus. So Onesiphorus was one of Paul's stalwart companions, a great support, and he kept searching for Paul until he found him. He wasn't ashamed to visit Paul. He didn't give up easily. That verse 17, he searched hard until he found me, that inspired me as a young Christian to persevere, because it's a model of perseverance, even if you fail the first time. Onesiphorus didn't just persevere. It wasn't just a lack of shame that is honorable. It was that he cared about Paul. There was love. Time for some application. How about me? Am I proud of those who take a stand for Christ, especially if they do it in a very vigorous way, or am I embarrassed by them? Now, of course, some behaviors can be embarrassing, and some of those things are not wise. Jesus encourages discretion. We're to be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. But when someone's doing the right thing, are we willing to identify with them and stand up for them? How about outreach? Do we try to hide our Christian commitment? And when we do share, if people push back, then what do? Does it silence us? Or is pride or vanity keeping us from sharing with others? Are we ashamed of the gospel? Are we giving in to worldly values, overly concerned with being cool? That is, the way we dress and the way we talk and our kind of humor? Are we terrified of being judged and labeled as intolerant or bigots who can see no way but their way? Are we afraid of being called judgmental? If we understand the message of the gospel, and particularly if we read 2 Timothy, we'll be less tempted. We'll be more inspired to do what is right, because this is a huge theme, and it very much dominates chapter 1. And by the way, it seems that Paul was effective in his appeal to Timothy. The reason I say that is that at some point, and it may have been after Paul's execution, I don't know, whoever wrote the Hebrew letter makes this comment. Hebrews 13:23. I want you to know that our brother Timothy, has been released. If he comes in time, he'll be with me when I see you. So it's just a little personal note there. At the end of Hebrews, which is, this amazing treatise, no one knows who wrote it, but just in passing mentioning that Timothy has been released. I think this means released from prison, which means in a way he was following Paul. He was willing to endure imprisonment. Now, what will motivate us to live this way? My final thought is that ultimately only looking to the Lord for approval will keep us from caving in to the pressure of the world. And so I'd like to read just a very short passage from Psalm 34. I sought the Lord, and he answered me, and he delivered me from all my fears. Those who look to him are radiant. Their faces are never covered with shame. What a great passage. We look to the Lord, we're going to have much less of a shame problem. In fact, we'll be radiant. Next time, Last Will and Testament. That's the title of our message. As we look at our last message from the letters of Paul. After that, we'll be going to the Old Testament. Thank you for listening.